Hey y'all, this is Radical Reads. Today I'm going to be reading the late Ernest Mandel's Economic Roots of American Imperialism, published in 1970. If you'd like to go straight to the reading, there are timestamps on this video, so feel free to skip ahead. Okay, before we get started, let's do a bit of background and overview on Ernest Mandel and the analysis that he presents in this text. Ernest Mandel was a Marxist economist and prominent member of the Fourth International. He was born in 1923 in Frankfurt to a Polish Jewish family. As a teenager, he was recruited into resistance organizations fighting the Nazis, where he was ultimately arrested. Mandel was sent to the German concentration camp at Dora and did survive his imprisonment. He published many writings on Marxist economics, including the book Marxist Economic Theory in 1962. After Che Guevara read that book, he invited Mandel to come to Cuba, where they worked on economic plans together. He is also credited with popularizing the term late capitalism in his book titled as such and published in 1975, which analyzes the end of the post-war boom and the recession of the 1970s as stages towards capitalism's inevitable transformation and eventual demise. Mandel was banned from entering West Germany, the United States, and several other countries because of his support of Marxism and world communism. How scary. Mandel died in Brussels in 1995. On the left is a picture of Ernest Mandel, and on the right is a picture of him with Che Guevara, most likely photographed in 1964. So let's talk a little bit about our reading today. Here, Mandel is offering an expansion of Lenin's definition of imperialism, specifically to include the transformation and uniqueness of American imperialism compared to European imperialism. I highly recommend reading Lenin's writings on imperialism to understand the full picture of how Mandel is building on top of Lenin's analysis. But for a little bit of context, Lenin explains the capitalists' reasoning for advancing to this higher stage of capitalism as the search for super profits. Operating in the home countries, they're met with heavy limitations, like the increasing demands for higher wages and better conditions from their workers, reaching limits in resources able to be extracted, as well as the typical capitalist greedy desire to compete for profits against foreign companies in industries moving towards monopoly like electric, steel, or rail, so they have to go elsewhere. Lenin's definition, as applied in the text, is the existence of a surplus of capital, which is poured into other parts of the globe in search of super profits. So, Western companies flood colonial and semi-colonial countries, opening up companies that double as political strong arms that operate in those colonial and semi-colonial countries. Think United Fruit in Guatemala or the British East India Company. I understand that this is a very brief and heavily reduced description of Lenin's analysis in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, published in 1917. I highly recommend this book as a foundational text to get the full picture of what Mandel is expanding on, so please don't just rely on my overview. Really cannot recommend that book enough. But I wanted to provide some background to what Mandel is building on top of before we get into the text. Okay, so Mandel's extension is that these companies no longer only pour that surplus capital for the search of super profits into just colonial or semi-colonial countries, and that those profits are increasingly invested into other industrial countries. And he offers 4 observations that support that argument, and we'll talk a little bit about each one. So first, American technology and productivity. Mandel discusses the plethora of raw materials that the land the United States stole through colonial pillage and genocide provides, giving it another advantage over other imperialist countries who do not have that scale of raw materials within their own borders and must acquire them by conquering other nations. The United States didn't have to do this, which gave it a significant advantage in advancing its technological development, which meant higher productivity in producing commodities, which then means an advantage in forming monopolies and strengthening the power of those monopolies. Second, he discusses the military and political power of the states in comparison to other imperialist countries. He describes the military-industrial complex as a vessel for endless investment and capital growth in a way that doesn't threaten monopoly by creating competition. He uses Rosa Luxemburg's phrase, substitutive field of unparalleled investment, to describe this. Endless war means endless investment and endless profit. Or, I should say, seemingly endless profit until capitalism's inevitable demise. I think that this is the section that hit me the most, specifically the very last few sentences where Mandel brings up the possibility of the profits of the military-industrial complex being invested into public services like education or healthcare, then very bluntly tells us that this will never happen. Lenin makes a similar argument in Imperialism, the Highest Stage. Responding to petty bourgeois critics of capitalism, he says that the profits of capitalism could be invested in agriculture to raise the standard of living to the masses, but that would never happen, because then capitalism wouldn't be capitalism. Capitalism's purpose is the highest amount of profits for the capitalists, and investing in the genuine well-being of the workers would reduce profits, so that would never happen. The minuscule concessions the capitalist class grants us are by no means liberatory. They're just enough to keep us alive to work, sedated to not revolt, to keep us under. Lenin and Mandel's arguments are important and necessary to hold in our analyses. Their points are not discussing the goodwill or bad will of the capitalists. We shouldn't be concerned on whether people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or any capitalist are good or bad people. It doesn't matter. What does matter is the conditions of the economic system we live under, and that's total, unimpeded profit. So our only option is the destruction of capitalism, not more welfare or more social safety nets from the governments that oppress us. The United States and all imperialist countries are unforgiving, murderous war machines and should be treated as such with no alternative, only complete destruction. Thank y'all for letting me vent a little bit. So Mandel's third and fourth reasons kind of build on top of each other, so we'll talk about them together. Mandel discusses the increasing insecurity of those investments in colonial and semi-colonial countries because of the revolutionary movements in those countries. He also discusses the existence of the USSR as a massive threat to capitalism and creates contradictions within inter-imperialist competition. Companies from one imperialist power like the United States compete for profits against the companies of other imperialist powers within the colonies, but that competition can only go so far before they're forced to work together, even if that contradicts the profit motive because of the threat of the USSR. And finally, because of the growth of the USSR and other socialist movements, the geographic areas that are available to imperialist investment start to become limited. His third and fourth reasons are expanded on through analyzing the coups and political and military interventions done by the United States in defense of the current investments in colonial and semi-colonial countries, like in Venezuela to protect oil investments, or in Brazil to protect steel investments. This also protects future opportunities for investment and is used to stop chain reactions that can occur in a globalized economic system and could threaten profits. He uses the American imperialist war on Vietnam as a perfect example of this. While U.S. companies did not have significant investments in South Vietnam, they did have significant investments in Malaysia and Indonesia. The threat of revolutionary communist movements spreading to and succeeding in Vietnam's neighboring countries that did have those investments was completely unacceptable and had to be stopped. Fear of communism's threat to democracy or whatever Red Scare bullshit is an ideological and idealist scapegoat that was used to hide the real and financial reasons for America's siege on Vietnam. So why does this reading actually matter? Well, the most important part about this text can be summed up by Mandel's final sentence. Quote, "That is why an analysis of the global economic moving forces of American imperialism can come to only one conclusion. To be effective, anti-capitalist forces must oppose the international counter-revolutionary strategy of big capital with a corresponding worldwide global strategy." End quote. To combat the global system of imperialist capitalism, we must develop a global revolutionary strategy to win, and we have to understand the functions and material conditions of imperialism and global capitalism in order to do this successfully. Constantly building on theory to fit our constantly changing conditions, just like Mandel is doing here with Lenin, is a requirement for a strong dialectical and material political analysis that we use to develop our global strategy to win. And defeating imperialism must be the root of that political struggle, especially if you live in an imperialist country like I do. Our living standards are higher because of the benefits that we reap from imperialism, just from living in an imperialist country. So we must stand in genuine, direct solidarity with all oppressed peoples by combating imperialism. A socialist revolution contained within an imperialist country is a delusion, and it's undialectical, because defeating a global capitalist system requires a global revolution. And to make that happen, we and the imperial core must be principled to our colonized comrades. I tried to be a bit more thorough in this discussion section, but I'm not sure if every video will have a section as extensive as this one. I might be a little lazy with it in others, but please let me know what you thought and if you found it helpful. Any feedback and suggestions are super appreciated. Be sure to check out my other videos and like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. I'm always really interested in hearing y'all's thoughts and opinions about the texts I read, even if you disagree with them. If you have any questions or comments about the text, or just want to discuss anything political, or you just want a couple more ways to stay in touch, or have any other inquiries, feel free to follow me on Instagram at radicalreads1312 and shoot me a DM, or you can email me at radicalreads1312@gmail.com. And you can buy me a coffee if you'd like to show a little extra love and support. Okay, thank y'all so much for being here, and let's get started. The Economic Roots of American Imperialism, written by Ernest Mandel, published 1970. The manifestations of American imperialism began to appear as early as the 19th century, relative to Latin American countries, and later in the Pacific Zone, expansionism towards Japan, conquest of the Philippines. Since the beginning of World War I, American imperialism has extended itself on a global scale. Thus, in the framework of inter-imperialist competition, American imperialism appears as the great victor of two imperialist world conflicts. In point of fact, it is the only victor whose military and economic forces gained from these two wars. All of the principal competitors were enfeebled by either one or both of these conflicts. It is not necessary to examine in detail the cause of this superiority of American imperialism over her competitors. The principal reasons are well known: immense richness in raw materials, greater equilibrium between industry and agriculture, broader territorial and demographic bases which permitted the enjoyment of important economies of scale in matters of industrial mass production, the absence of semi-feudal vestiges which allowed the expansion of a purer capitalism than that of the other imperialist countries, etc. It must be accentuated, however, that the ascent of American imperialism towards the position of the first power in the world represents a dialectical process during which the contradictions of the rest of the world have had a tendency to breed, even in the midst of American society. The imperialist American bourgeoisie cannot engage in this expedition towards world domination without at the same time assuming the leadership of the entire capitalist world. In that position, they are confronted by anti-capitalist forces, which each day grow more numerous and powerful. Because of this fact, American imperialism is often directed in its decisions by the political imperatives involved in the global defense of the international capitalist system, a system which at times may enter into conflict with the particular historical interests of American imperialism itself. The Marshall Plan has to be interpreted in this light. Far from being an enterprise of the pastoralization of Europe or of its submission to the will of Washington, historically, the Marshall Plan was the initial phase in the reconstitution of an autonomous force in Western European imperialism, that is to say, precisely the recreation of a force competitive with that of the United States. This decision was not, however, irrational. It simply reflects a choice between two evils, both of which Washington had to face following the Second World War: either assist in the collapse of Western European capitalism or permit the appearance of a powerful competitor. American imperialism chose the lesser evil by its lights. These prefatory remarks are essential in order to avoid falling into economism and to prevent too simple an interpretation of the economic roots of American imperialism. 1. Surplus and export of capital. The principal economic root of American imperialism remains the one classically defined by Lenin for the whole imperialist era: the existence in imperialist countries of a surplus of capital which is poured into the other parts of the globe in search of super profits. The only modification which should be applied to the Leninist definition is the conclusion that, in actual historical context of the period following the Second World War, this surplus of capital was no longer directed exclusively, nor even principally, into colonial or semi-colonial, i.e. underdeveloped countries, but was spread equally and in increasing proportions among other industrially developed imperialist lands. This important variant of the Leninist theory can be explained by the following factors. 1. The significant difference in technology and the productivity of labor between American imperialism on the one hand and that of the other imperialist powers on the other. 2. The difference between the military and political power of the United States and that of the other imperialist powers, a difference which is even more pronounced than that in the economic sphere. 3. The increasing insecurity weighing upon investments in colonial and semi-colonial countries, in which there is a growing profusion of revolutionary liberation movements. 4. The contraction of the geographic area in which surplus capital may still be invested with profit, a contraction resulting notably from the overthrow of capitalism in an expanding portion of the world. During the last quarter of the century, the essential direction of the investment of exported American capital has been into the other imperialist countries. The end result of these diverse tendencies is that the difference between the rate of profit in the United States and that which American capital, exploiting advantages of productivity, which consequently assured it significant monopolistic super profits, may obtain in other countries is sufficiently large to make exportation of capital into other imperialist countries definitely more appealing than investments in underdeveloped countries where greater insecurity neutralizes the attraction of an even higher rate of profit. Certainly, as American capital gradually discovers outlets in the world, a process of equal distribution and the leveling off of the productivity of labor and technological development will progressively occur between the United States and the other imperialist countries. Such a process will reduce the difference in the rate of profit between them and will revalorize the underdeveloped world as the only area where important superprofits may be acquired. In the same way, an eventual prolongation of détente between the United States and the Soviet Union will open possibilities, although very modest ones, of investment of American capital in countries with a socialist economic base, similar to that already achieved by Fiat and Renault in the automotive field. But all of the investment possibilities cannot change the fundamental fact that during the last quarter of a century, the essential direction of the investment of exported American capital has been into other imperialist countries rather than to the rest of the world. It must be remembered that this export of capital admirably suits an economic necessity inherent in the capitalist system of monopolies. It represents a response to a double menace: the decline in the average rate of profit experienced in the principal imperialist citadel, and the massive accumulation of capital, which cannot be invested in that citadel without endangering the average rate of profit with a new, serious decline. 2. The growing role of the war and armaments economy in the United States. The accumulation of a growing surplus of capital which can no longer be profitably invested in the normal sectors of the economy not only encourages its export, but also increases research in new fields of investment where capital will yield an average profit from the monopolized sectors of the economy without threatening the rate of profit from the entire system of monopolistic capital. The production of armaments and its extension into space production constitutes a similar substitutive field of unparalleled investment, to use Rosa Luxemburg's phrase. The advantages of the realization of monopolistic capital in the area of armaments are obvious. It does not reduce the scope of capital already invested in the rest of industry. On the contrary, it markedly stimulated the production of heavy industry and certain specific raw materials. It does not become a substitute for other products normally produced. On the contrary, it creates merchandise whose sole purchaser is the state, and whose only value in terms of consumption is the strengthening of American imperialism internationally. It creates, in addition, other by no means negligible marginal benefits. It permits the reduction of conjunctural fluctuations by stabilizing a considerable volume of investment. Thus, it protects the American economy against a return of catastrophic crisis, similar to that of 1929, without the power, however, to prevent the appearance of periodic recessions, which are not finally any less grave than the average crises which capitalism has known throughout its history. It brings an automatic guarantee of profit to monopolies in a growing number of sectors, all those related to national defense. The increasing importance of arms production in the American economy is indicated above all by the preponderance it acquires in expanding sectors, such as electronics, aircraft, and chemistry. It results in a double symbiosis, which stimulates the imperialist expansion of American capital by producing a double self-perpetuation. 1. The symbiosis of certain areas of the monopolies and of the production of armaments in these areas, developing a vested interest in the maintenance and expansion of arms production. 2. The symbiosis of certain positions of authority in the armed forces and in the machinery of state, which gives these positions a vested interest in the maintenance and expansion of the military budget at an astronomical level. This double symbiosis is all the more dangerous since it tends to reproduce itself in foreign countries. Following the establishment of American bases abroad, the military missions in foreign countries, and the military aid to friendly governments menaced by internal subversion or by external communist aggression. Even former President Eisenhower, as conservative as he was at the end of his presidency, publicly expressed his fears about the formidable growth of the industrial military political establishment. That establishment lives on and prospers essentially from the continual increase in arms expenditures, and it requires international conflicts in order to justify this expansion to the American taxpayer. Nevertheless, it would be foolish to consider the important role the production of armaments plays in the heart of the American economy as simply the result of maneuvers by this particular mafia in the center of the large American bourgeoisie. The entire bourgeoisie is condemned to practice the politics of permanent rearmament, confronted as it is with a permanent revolution on a worldwide scale and with the industrial and military growth of countries which have already overthrown capitalism. The goal of every one of the disarmament conferences is not actual disarmament, but the attempt to rationalize the course of armament, to render it supportable by the budgets of the USA and the USSR, which are not, after all, unlimited. In a world divided into two profoundly antagonistic camps, genuine disarmament is utopian. Still more utopian is the idea that monopoly capitalism could reorient the $60 or $70 billion it annually spends on arms production to fields of public service, education, health, and aid to underdeveloped countries. Such a redirection would first of all require the conversion of the bourgeoisie, the very class devoted to profit motives, into a class working for the good of the human species. Any diffusion of masses of capital outside the areas of disarmament would rapidly menace the investment of civil capital and the rate of profit. It will never happen. 3. Supply of strategic raw materials. Unlike most of its competitors, American imperialism was characterized by the fact that it found within its own borders the essential raw materials for modern industry. Even in the period immediately following World War I, the importation of raw materials remained fundamentally secondary. Rubber, silk, sugar, or tin products easily replaced by synthetics. However, the formidable expansion of American industrial production at the end of World War II changed the situation. Today, the USA must import increasing quantities of raw materials as essential as petroleum, iron ore, bauxite, copper, manganese, and nickel. However, America's own resources in these areas are rapidly diminishing and, in the case of petroleum, could be exhausted by the end of the century. America depends entirely upon imports for chromium, cobalt, and columbarium, indispensable to iron production. In other words, 3/4 of a century behind its principal competitors, the USA must now launch a drive for new sources of raw material in the world. for petroleum in Latin America, the Middle East, and Nigeria, for iron ore in Latin America and West Africa, for other materials in Canada, Australia, and Africa, etc. In this search, it will collide not only with liberation movements in various colonial and semi-colonial countries, but with the competition of other imperialist nations like Great Britain, Japan, France, West Germany, indeed, even Spain. Often the appropriation and possession of these sources of raw materials involves political conflict, coups d'etats, and local war, notably in West Africa in the last few years. It may involve the establishment of missions, perhaps American military bases. The need for new sources explains the tenacity with which American imperialism clings to countries like Venezuela and Brazil, for they have become precisely the sources of supply of raw materials indispensable for big business in the United States. In the end, American imperialism will not achieve world domination. 4. Inter-imperialist competition in the heart of the Third World. Although the export of American capital into underdeveloped countries has been of less volume than the same export into other imperialist countries, nonetheless, it has not been negligible. When it concerns important countries like Indonesia or Brazil, or countries of enormous, scarcely tapped potential like the Congo, the export of American capital results in growing interference by American imperialism in the internal affairs of these semi-colonial countries. Conflicts develop with other imperialist powers, particularly the former colonial powers which American imperialism is gradually replacing. In the last 20 years, the most typical examples of the way in which American capital has taken over from former colonial capital are its domination of Indonesia, replacing Dutch capital, Morocco, replacing French capital, and Iran, replacing English capital. Without a doubt, in the Congo, we are witnessing the debut of a similar replacement of capital, in this case Belgian, although at this moment it is reflected less in capital investments than in the reorientation of foreign trade. All this imperialist substitution was not achieved simply by maneuvering behind the scenes. It produced acute national and international conflicts, often accompanied by bloodbaths. From the overthrow of Mossadegh to the assassination of Ben Barka and the ascent to power of Mobutu by a coup d'etat, the course of this substitution was marked by murder, conspiracy, and oppressive operations whose victims number in the hundreds of thousands. In the end, American imperialism will not achieve world domination. The dream of an American century lasted in fact only 5 years, from 1945 to 1950. The dream was destroyed not only by the strengthening of anti-capitalist forces on a world scale, but by the law of unequal development, which functions inexorably in the heart of the imperialist world and does not permit any acquired position to last forever. In comparison with the 1945 to 1950 period, the principal competitors of American imperialism, with the exception of Great Britain, have been strengthened, not weakened, their positions relative to American imperialism. The inter-imperialist competition is more acute than before. There will be no super-imperialism, but rather a continued struggle of imperialist forces to shift the revenue of power in their favor. However, the battle of inter-imperialist competition is taking place in a new global context. The loss of capital of a third of the world, the constant extension of new revolutionary forces and movements that threaten to wrest new countries away from capital, In these conditions, inter-imperialist competition will dissolve into inter-imperialist solidarity before the vital threats which weigh on the total system. Stalin's hope of seeing the outbreak of new inter-imperialist wars turns out to be in vain, assuming one disregards local conflicts between various pawns of imperialism in Africa, Cyprus, and elsewhere. 5. The defense of general conditions and the realization of capital. One of the economic motives appropriate to American imperialism is that of defending the conditions of realization of invested American capital when those conditions seem to be deteriorating or when they are exposed to threat. It is precisely in this sense that the coup d'etat in Guatemala in defense of the investments of United Fruit must be understood, or the military mission to Venezuela defending the investments of Creole Petroleum, or the intervention of the CIA in the military coup d'etat in Brazil in defense of United States Steel Corporation investments. The same intervention in the military coup d'etat in Greece permitted America's linen industries to make huge investments of capital under exceptionally favorable conditions. However, it would be false to see this imperialist intervention in too restricted a way, that is, as merely the defense of capital already invested. Additionally, imperialist intervention is a question of preserving future opportunities and avoiding the danger of a chain reaction, which would menace strong positions in one country by events in another. For example, direct investments of American capital in South Vietnam are very modest, but there are more important investments in Thailand and considerably more important ones in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and India. By intervening with a counter-revolutionary war of aggression in the Civil War in Vietnam, American imperialism covers capitalist positions in all the neighboring countries and attempts to preserve its future opportunities in the eastern part of the Asian continent. Today, the imperialist strategy is unavoidably a global one. Necessarily, the defense of capital does not take place where that capital is invested, but occurs in other countries, the collapse of whose advanced positions would constitute a grave threat to those properly called strong areas. That is why an analysis of the global economic moving forces of American imperialism can only come to one conclusion. To be effective, anti-capitalist forces must oppose the international counter-revolutionary strategy of big capital with a corresponding worldwide global strategy. And that's the end of the text. Thank y'all for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned something interesting and radicalizing. It's always super cool to hear y'all's perspectives, so feel free to leave a comment letting me know what you thought, even if you disagreed with the text. Be sure to check out my other videos and like, subscribe, and share. Again, thank you so much for being here, and until next time, love and solidarity from the South.